Howdy there, folks. Welcome back to another tutorial. Today we're going to learn how to create globally accessible data for our application using Vue's provide inject pattern. I have opened the browser to our last tutorial, and in this tutorial we created a little login form at this auth page or view, which allows us to either sign up or sign in, log in a user. Unfortunately, I use login and sign in interchangeably. Sorry about that, but this is our login page. We'll create today some utility functions for posting to the login and sign up endpoints of our Golang account API that we previously created. We'll also create a global store which keeps track of the currently authorized user and their ID token, and also maintains some state for whether we're loading the authorized user or if there's an error retrieving that user. So I'm back in the application, and for now I'm just going to shut down Docker. And to get started, we're going to create an auth store in the source folder and create a new folder called store, where we in theory could create multiple stores. For this application, we'll only have one auth store, which we'll put in auth.js. And in here, we're also going to export certain features that allow us to access user authorization data anywhere in our Vue application tree. So this would be like a dumb or simple version of Vuex that instead of sending out actions with, strings for names or maybe some TypeScript union for a name, we're actually just going to create methods that modify a state, and this state will only be read-only throughout our application. To be able to create our own sort of reactive object in Vue, we need to import something called a reactive type in Vue that will wrap an object which contains fields that denote our state. Let's add some code here. First, we need to include the import for this reactive, and then we're going to create state, which will track our current user, the user's ID token in sort of the raw JWT format, a state for when this user is loading, so that way we can kind of hide pages or put a loading token in our application, or a loading indicator, I should say, in our application when the user's loading, and a possible error in loading or fetching a user. And I've also added these other imports up top, which we'll use soon enough. Now, when we wrap an object in reactive, this is sort of Vue's underlying reactivity system. And so if we change these fields inside of a reactive object, which is a proxy, I think it's called, our templates will be able to see those changes and re-render. Let's now learn how to get this state into our application's component tree. To do this, I'm going to create something called an auth store, which is an object which will contain this state. And I forgot to import one type called read-only. Let me add that. Read-only. So what's going on here? Why am I spreading and using this two refs? Well, it turns out this reactive type is used to track an object, and so to use it reactively, we can't really destructure the fields on this state. But if we use two refs, that basically will give us read-only versions of the individual fields, which we then can kind of access with the spread operator, with destructuring inside our application. So we won't always have to access in our component tree state.currentUser. If we use this two refs, we can just destructure off the current user from the auth store. Now, we're not going to just export this auth store and import it directly. However, I am exporting it so that we have access to it in Vue Router. So that's the only reason that we're exporting it here. But we're going to use the provide and inject pattern to be able to get access to this auth store in our application tree. And I've added some code that will allow us to do so. The first thing that I want to do is create something called a symbol. And this symbol is like a unique identifier, so our store will be able to be located with it. So we use provide here with this store symbol, and then on that symbol, we're able to find the auth store. And then inside of the app, we can use inject with this same unique store symbol to be able to find or locate what we are providing. I hope I've said that right. That's a little tricky. Now we're going to export our provide with the store symbol in its own little method here called provide auth. And that's just to obscure the whole store symbol. We could also export the store symbol from this and then use this provide function elsewhere. But I just want to kind of obfuscate it from our application tree and just call provide auth. Now I briefly mentioned this inject, but what about this whole wrapping it in use auth? This is going to create a sort of view composable that we'll be able to use in our setup functions, which will inject this provided auth store. So the returned type or value of this inject is the actual store. However, if we find that this store can't be located, meaning it's not existing in our application tree, or it's not existing in a parent component of where we call use auth, then we're going to throw an error. Otherwise, of course, we'll return the store. So we can use auth, and that will return this object right here. Let's now test out that we can get this to work. And we'll do so by providing this store in our top level app component here, app.view. In fact, let's close a lot of these files. Let's just go to app.view here. And this is where we will provide the auth. So first we need to import it. And then we'll create a setup function inside of our view component here in the script. And in that, we will just call this provide auth. So now we should be able to inject the auth using the use auth composable that we created in auth.js. So let's save this baby. And then for now, let's just maybe go to the details component. Let's clear out a lot of this template that we already have. We're not going to, this was just to test getting the user to make sure our API worked. Let's clear a lot of this out. And we also don't need some of these imports. And we'll have to add something in this template. Now let's use the auth that we exported from our store. So first I'll add an import. And then we can use this use auth, I'm saying the word use a lot, inside of our setup function. Now to get access to the current user in the template, we need to return it as always. And so what I'll do is just make an h1 tag inside of the template, which will return the current user or show the current user. And so let's save. And then I'm going to rerun this application. I shouldn't need to rebuild anything because we haven't changed any dependencies. Maybe I'll fast forward this. So I open the page and refresh because I had stopped the Docker Compose environment. And let's go to Home Details. And of course, you don't see anything because the user is null. So this isn't actually very helpful yet. But if we go to View Developer Tools, and you will need to make sure you have the View Beta Developer Tools. Otherwise, you can't see values returned from a setup function. And we see that the current user is null. Now let's maybe just go to the application. Let's go back to our auth store and maybe just set the user to some sort of string like user. And let's save this. This won't work with the hot module reloading, but let's refresh the page and let's hopefully then go to this home details component and you see it says user. And if we go to the details page, we can see the current user is user. So we're able to inject our store down our application tree. I now want to take a little bit of a right turn and set up some utility methods for fetching data and also storing our tokens in local storage. We're going to need to use these methods inside of our auth store shortly. So I want to create a util folder inside of source. And then inside of here, we're only going to have a single file with a couple of functions. So we'll just call it index.js. The first thing I want to do is create a little wrapper for our Axios requests. So I'm just going to paste some code and explain what's going on. And save. So first of all, we will import Axios. And then this little doRequest method is just going to take the general request options that are from an Axios request config. So you'll pass the same thing you would to Axios here. But basically what we're going to do is create a try catch block. And in the try block, we're just going to access Axios's response.data, which would be the successful result. But if we get an error, there are two types of errors that can occur in Axios. One is a response error, like a status 400, and those errors come in on the response.data.error field. But then there could be like networking errors, your request doesn't go through, and those actually come directly in on the e.request. Otherwise, we'll just handle the error generically, console it, and then we're going to return two fields, either the successful data here or the error. And these are kind of initialized to null with this let statements here. And so this is a way just to handle all our errors in the same way. This may not be what you want in your use case, but it'll simplify things to give us one error or data. Next, we're going to create a method to store both our tokens and then another one to decode a JSON web token payload. Now, we don't need to verify the JWT payload. This is just a nice way to extract that base 64 string that JWTs create. Now, we could reach out to a me handler that we have in our API that returns fresh user given a token, but we don't always want to reach out to our API, and we trust the token's user data. So the first thing we're going to need to do is import a new library, and that's going to be called JWT decode, but of course we'll need to install that. So let's first actually terminate this Docker Compose environment, and then we're going to change directories into our account client. And I thought I had saved this or installed this dep earlier, but let's just go ahead and install it now. JWT decode. And then we'll be able to use this guy. So let's import it inside of this index.js file at the top. And then we'll create a couple little functions to export here. Let's scroll down. Add a comment here. All right. So we'll have one little utility function that basically just takes an ID token and refresh token as raw JSON web tokens, and we'll store them in two separate items. And so they'll be called malcorp ID and malcorp RF for refresh. Then we also create another method called getTokenPayload, which takes a raw JSON web token and basically just decodes that base 64 and makes sure it's valid, and then returns those actual claims, meaning the user and I guess the other expiry fields and things like that on the token. Now that we have our utility methods, let's turn back to our auth and let's import those utility functions that we just used. Great, so we have store tokens, do request, and get token payload. And then I want to create a function called authenticate down at the bottom that will not be exported or exposed. So here it is, but because signing in and signing up are basically the same, they both receive an email and a password. The only difference is the URL that we'll be reaching out to. So basically we'll call authenticate for both a sign in and sign up method. When we do that, we're going to set our states loading and then clear out any possible error that's existing. And then we're going to reach out with this do request wrapper we just created around Axios with the URL passed in as a parameter. Both of these will have a post method, and on the data we'll be sending an email and password. If we receive an error, we're going to set the state's error, and then we'll stop loading. In all cases, we want to stop loading, and we'll return. Otherwise, we'll extract tokens field from the data. Now, I could go into Postman, but let's just save ourselves the turmoil. If we do get data from our API, there will be a data.tokens field. And on that, we have an ID token stored as the raw JSON web token and a refresh token. For the ID token, we're going to want to extract the user from it. So we're going to use that get token payload that we just created. Now, if it fails, it will be null. And if it's successful, we get an actual user. Then we set our state's ID token to tokens.id token. and the current user to the actual claims on that. On the token claims, though, notice this is the tokens claims that we extracted, whereas this is just the ID token from the raw token data. And then we'll set is loading to false. Now we're going to create sign in and sign up methods that will be exported by this store, or I should say accessible in the provided store to our application tree. So let's scroll up a little bit. After we create this reactive state, let's go ahead and create two methods, sign in and sign up. And so these take an email and password, and you can see that they are kind of just forwarding a call to the authenticate method here. There you go. And then the only difference is one calls the sign in route and the other calls the sign up endpoint. Endpoint route, I guess I'm interchanging words. Then we need to make these available in our auth store. So now, wherever we call use auth in our application tree, we'll now have access to these methods. Great, so now let's rebuild this application. I'm going to try to do it with force recreate. I've had issues with the dependencies reinstalling, so I may have to run Docker Compose up and down a few times to get this to work. I hope not, but I may fast forward a bit. All right, so after running Docker Compose up twice, I also had to run Docker Compose down. If someone knows what the problem is, please leave a comment. But it looks like our application is working with the new import. So let's go back to the browser and refresh. I have some dev tools open here as well. And let's go into our auth.view component and use our auth state here. So we haven't opened that yet today. Let's go to views, auth.view. And in here, we'll use auth. So in the setup function, right after we use login, let's use auth, which of course we need to import. And that will be, use auth from, should be up one directory, store auth. All right. So now we should be able to get access to our user and the sign up and sign in methods. And remember that I use two refs so I can access reactive current user error and is loading. I'm going to admit that using Views Reactivity API is a little confusing and takes a while to get used to. Now, inside of our auth submitted method, we need to handle the case of whether it is sign up or sign in, and then reach out to the method accordingly, or the desired method. So if it's login, and remember when we access is login inside of setup, we need to get its value. And so if it is true, we'll call the sign in method, and I call it login here and sign in here. Sorry about that. Otherwise, we'll call sign up. Then we want to take the other values from this use auth and return them to our template. And I'll use prettier to format. Now we could go and add UI to all this stuff, but this video is getting a little bit long. So what I want to do today is just use the Vue dev tools and the browser networking tools to see what's going on here. So before we look at this in the dev tools, I just want to open up pgadmin and make sure or see what users we have available in our current table. So let's maybe increase the size of this for you guys at home. And let's refresh this and see if we can get our database here. Postgres, schemas, tables. Let's see if we have some data here. All right, so we already have a guy01. In fact, let's just clear all these. And then that way we can create a fresh user and then try signing in. So great, we have no users in our table. Back to the app. Let's go to the auth now. And I want to go to the network tab and try changing the speed. So the reason I want to do this is so we can see the changing of the is loading state. So let's make this maybe slow 3G. And then we can go to our Vue developer tools and go to the auth component. Now to be able to see stuff in the setup component, as I mentioned, you'll need the beta version of the Vue developer tools. Right on. So let's maybe expand this up a little And let's add, well, first we need to sign up, and then let's add bob@bob.com, password of password. And because I have the dev tools, let's scroll down. Okay, we can sign up now. Now take an eye on this is loading state, or keep an eye. And it goes true for a minute. And then we get our user with a UID. And I thought I turned off LastPass for this. Great. So if we go to the network tab, we can see our call to sign up with a status 201. Let's now go to login. And let's use this same user. Of course, I should clear this state after this happens. We'll handle that later, but let's go to login and see if we can. Of course, I call it sign in here and login here. It's kind of inconsistent. All right, it returns and we see our user in the view state. Let's just see if we can see the is loading state if we sign in one more time. True, false, and maybe we can check to see if we have some local storage and we have these JSON web tokens. Oh, well, folks, thanks again for joining along. I know that was a little bit of a long one. Next time, we're going to work on a little bit of UI for showing the loading state of the user, as well as bringing our router into the application tree so that we can push to the home or details component after we've successfully signed up or signed in. And if we have time, maybe we'll add a little logic to check for an authorized user on the initial page load or add some authorized routing configuration. Still, I'm a little bit undecided. Take care. Hasta el próximo video. Que se cuiden.